Hello, everyone. It's Frances Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. I am very excited today to welcome Eric Kaufmann on the program, who is coming to us from Ontario, although Eric is a professor in the UK, and I'll just give a little bit more on him shortly. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Eric.
Francis, it's great to be here. It's an honor, really.
An honor. Anyway, Eric and I met at the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship meeting. I think that was the first time that we'd met. Oh, no, we met at Stanford as well.
So that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, he's a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, where he directs the Center for Heterodox Social Science. He is the author of The Third Awokening, Bombardier, May 14th, 2024. That was when it was published. Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution, which is from Forum Press. And I believe that's 2024 as well.
Yeah, that's the same. That's the British title for the same book, Third Awokening.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I'll take two books, however.
Okay. Yeah, I was going, wow, you are prolific. 2 books here. And then Whiteshift, Immigration, Populism, and the Future of White Majorities from Penguin 2018. Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? Profile Books 2010. The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, Harvard 2004, and The Orange Order. You've also written a number of newspapers in the United States and the UK. So we have about an hour and 10 minutes, I believe, is going to be the length of this program. But before we get into many of the discussions, especially on wokeism, which I think will be very, very interesting to have an interaction about that subject, because we both have theoretical ideas about it. But before we get into talking about some of these topics, I was wondering if you could just give our listeners a background of where you came from, and what your history in the academy.
Yeah, so I'm from Vancouver, but I did my undergraduate at Western Ontario, but then I did all my graduate work in Britain at the LSE, and so I came out of the LSE. I really was focused on the study of nationalism, and the LSE had a tradition of quite a few very prominent scholars of nationalism. Ernest Gellner, my supervisor Anthony Smith, who and so I kind of came out of that background. My first book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, was a sort of Harvard University Press book, so very much a standard academic press book, and it was based on my dissertation, which was looking at the sort of decline of the WASP, the Anglo-Protestant majority or former majority of the United States during the late 19th through to the mid to late 20th century. So that was kind of and that thesis involved three strands, which really are central to my work. One is this question of national identity and majority ethnicity. The second is demographic shifts through immigration or differential birth rates. And the third is ideological changes. So for example, in that thesis, I look very much at the early cultural left and left liberalism, particularly liberal progressivism, and the role it plays in the early 20th century, moving through to liberal pluralism. So really, before we get to the new left and all of that, really the precursors. I mean, I did look at the new left. Whereas in my later work, Whiteshift, I'm starting to talk more about questions of political correctness, which is more something that grows out of the new left. But I always take pains to tie those developments back to an earlier liberal progressive and what I would call left modernist phase in the early and mid 20th centuries, which is sort of the building block for the later wave. And then I sort of developed that the most really in my recent book, The Third Awokening, where I kind of try and draw out a sort of archaeology of woke, where it comes from. And I have a theory that it's that it has this long intellectual lineage, but that the intellectual side is arguably maybe, or at least the systematizing intellectual side is maybe not as important as the emotional ties to particular groups and the sacralizing and sanctity around those groups. So that's just a sort of very broad brush about me and my biography. Now, I'm sure we'll go into detail about, for example, cancel culture pressures,
Yes.
which I've chewed some of the same dirt you have.
Yeah.
Maybe not as bad in some ways,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah. So were you canceled?
Well, there was an attempt to cancel. It's a bit like the attempt on Trump's life. No, maybe not quite. Not quite that bad. But well, what did I have? I had sort of beginning around 2018 when I began to kind of come out of the closet and be a bit more frank about my thoughts about the social justice movement, especially on Twitter. But beginning about 2018, really, I started to get, there was an open letter. There was almost an annual Twitter mobbing from the radical students, and about 4 internal investigations. So between about 2018 and 2022,
Yeah.
this process, 4 to 5 years, always being under a bit of a cloud. And your record is never cleaned off. It's not like a speeding ticket where after a few years the points are wiped. It keeps getting dredged along for the next case. So yeah, that was my experience, and that alone probably wasn't enough to push me out. I mean, in Britain, I would say there's a bit more support, at least starting from about 2020 or thereabouts. The Free Speech Union plays a big role.
Yeah.
And certainly for me, by the time 2022 rolls around, they're giving me legal support, which, was helping with my university to the point where I actually wasn't concerned about being canceled anymore, at least professional penalties. I was concerned about an investigation into my research ethics, because that might mean that, and again, by research ethics, I'm talking about running surveys on public platforms where people are taking surveys for money. In other words, it's a joke that this is even under the ethics rubric, but just my worry was that if the wrong people got on the ethics committee, they would find excuses to block my research. Yeah. So that was perhaps the most critical thing prompting me to leave, which I did in 2022. It's also worth saying the university was in a bit of financial trouble, and so there was added uncertainty around redundancies. So all of those reasons contributed. And then Buckingham was there as the only real, the only university out of 181 in Britain that has a sort of free speech oriented leadership. Now, most students and staff are still leaning left, but at least the leadership is pretty openly prioritizing free speech over social justice. So that was very attractive.
Okay. And before you were at the University of Buckingham, which university were you at? Sorry.
Yeah, so I had basically 24 years in what you might call the mainstream system. So 4 years at Southampton, which is it's the University of Southampton for 4 years as a lecturer, full-time, but as a lecturer, and then 20 years at Birkbeck, University of London, where I was I got a professorship there in 2011. So, a long time in the mainstream system. And I sort of was ready for a change anyway.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I find it's interesting, your nationalism, your background in nationalism, which I'm also have a lot of interest in. And I was Anthony Smith. I'm familiar with his work. Oh, here we go.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
But anyway, I've got a whole shelf of nationalism stuff, and also chosen people. Peoples. I looked at that quite a lot in my examinations of the indigenous question and the Jewish question and the comparison. But I think wokeness, since we don't have that much time, and wokeness is a huge area that I think many people are interested in right now. Perhaps I'll just jump to there and let's talk about your new book on the third awakening. And I was wondering, first of all, I guess we should define woke, what is meant by woke, and we can start there. And so Eric,
Yes.
let us know how you define wokeism or woke.
So, yeah, so the one sentence definition of woke is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. And I actually think that's a social scientific and a robust definition, which I'd be willing to defend. And notice it's not just anything I don't like, right? I mean, I'm not including, there's nothing in there about vaccines and about carbon taxes and low taxes and any of that stuff, because I think that's not actually, there may be family resemblances here and there in terms of orthodoxies and pressures, but that's outside the definition. So I'm focusing really on those sacred identity categories. And what flows from that is a kind of, so it starts with these concrete emotional attachments to particular entities, Black, indigenous, trans, gay, etc. And feminism I would include in that as well. So you've got this empathy for and sacredness that surrounds these groups, attachments to these groups. The flip side of that is whoever's oppressing them is the evil one. So majorities are bad, minorities are good. Majorities defined typically in racial, ethnic, or sexual terms. So that is the sort of view of the world, and it's very focused on these particular symbols. And out of those symbols comes particular narratives and myths. It could be Jim Crow, Holocaust. It could be the oppression of gays. These are the kind of narratives, and if we don't watch out, pretty soon women will be back in the home and gays in the closet, and we're going to have segregation, and it'll be Germany 1933 all over again. So boy, we can't let them have an inch. And that's sort of the outlook. Now, notice what I'm focusing on there is that out of this making sacred comes this ethos, which says that we have to have equal outcomes and emotional harm protection, emotional safety from microaggressions. This is the newer terminology. The older terminology was self-esteem, but it's the emotional harm protection and the equal outcomes that flows inductively from these particularistic attachments to and antipathies towards. So it's you're feeling cuddly about the groups you're going to protect, and you're feeling hostile and fearful of the oppressor group. And I think so. What I'm arguing essentially is that the whole philosophy, if there is one, is something that kind of flows as a kind of almost unintended inductive consequence of the very emotional attachments. So this is a empathizing and not a systematizing system like Marxism, for example, which has a whole theory about the economy and the way the world works.
Yes. So you mentioned, so there's a couple things here. One is the sacred, the idea of the sacred. And do you see that as a religious kind of thing? Or are you like, how are you seeing sacred there, I guess, is the first question.
Yeah, I would see it as religious. Now, of course, we can split hairs, as you know. I mean, say Anthony Smith and Durkheim would define religion as a group worshiping itself through a totem. So there you have conceptions of the sacred and the impure. And that, in that definition, that more communitarian definition of religion, which doesn't require the supernatural, then yes, woke definitely meets that definition of religion. If it requires some conception of supernatural powers, then no, this isn't really about the relationship to the divine and the supernatural. But it is it is an argument about sacred totems and symbols and boundaries between the profane and the sacred.
Yeah. Would you see it as like cannot be questioned? Is that what you're trying to get at there with the sacred?
Yeah, essentially, these are totems which cannot be offended. So you can't offend the gods. If you say anything that could be construed as offensive to indigenous, Black, gay, whatever, the reason you can be you're excommunicated from the community of believers. The community that worships these totems has to excommunicate those that defile the sacred, the pure. And so you have kind of marked yourself out as a blasphemer or a heretic by offending or blaspheming, and therefore you must be excommunicated or canceled.
Yes.
So it has the same dynamics as if you were cast out of the tribe
Yep.
for violating some taboo.
Yes. And there seems to be in the kind of the groups that you've chosen as being, because there's some groups that are not chosen to be part of the woke thing. Like I would imagine Jewish people would not be one as part of the woke kind of element.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think they have fewer points. So if we think of the totem pole of oppression points, clearly they are down the totem pole because they are perceived as white and therefore part of the oppressor.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they have some points, and the accusation of anti-Semitism has some power that's recognized even by the woke, because that it has elements that can be associated with racism there, biological racism, and therefore it still has some power within the. So I still think it's a narrative that is used by this ideology.
Yeah. What about disability? Is disability included in there?
So I would say no. I mean, here's what I would say about disability and class and even religion is that they just have, the volume button is turned much lower. They're much less central. So, they'll have a Pride Month and a Black History Month. Disability might get forgotten about because it doesn't have the place in the imagination. It doesn't have that kind of emotional power that the other symbols do. The storyline, what's your storyline behind the disability? The way you have Jim Crow and, I'm thinking of the Stonewall riots, or perhaps sort of feminist moments. There's nothing like that for disability. So I think, it's down the list, and neurodivergence and all these other things are. It's lip service, fat studies, all that. I think that's largely window dressing. I think it doesn't carry a lot of punch, and therefore it's less likely that you're going to be canceled for it, and it's less likely it's going to be emphasized in DEI, whereas the sacred symbols are going to be the ones that are pushed. It's going to be the rainbow flag, not the disability flag.
Yes. And I heard you say, I was listening to your presentation that you gave at SAFS again, and it seems to me you think that race is the central kind of identity for wokeism. Is that correct?
I would say that it has the highest level of intersectional clout, the largest number of points. And one of the ways you can see that is, do we see Black women disrupting Black Lives Matter or Black culture? Generally not. We don't see a sort of feminist critique and cancellations working for the upper echelons of the Black Power movement or the BLM movement. We, however, do see Black women successfully criticizing Black feminism or Black LGBT, criticizing the LGBT movement as being racist. So the racism charge can work against feminists and gays. The sexism charge doesn't seem to carry as much weight in these racial movements, whether it be indigenous or Black. It doesn't sting. It doesn't sort of cause people to lose their positions. And I think the reason is it just has a lower level. It's still high, but it's not as high on the totem pole as race.
And what about the trans phenomenon? How does that?
I think, well, if you saw trans, you wouldn't see a trans critique of the Black Lives Matter movement accusing BLM of being, cis heteronormative.
Transphobic.
Transphobic. And
it's
causing people to lose their.
Whether it would or not. Like because I'm kind of interested in the trans phenomenon as the wokest of the woke. Like there's nothing woker. I've said that myself because I see it as the most subjective of all the identities that are being put forward. Is that the race, although you have to identify, that's the thing about this kind of stuff, is that if you are just a Black person who's going about their business and you don't identify as that, and you're not making this as a political kind of identification type of maneuver, then wokeism isn't really very applicable. But the trans, that's all there is to it. Like it is all just people believing that they're trans. There's no
Right.
substance to it other than the belief.
Yeah, I suppose I don't see that as being the critical litmus test for woke. I see victimhood and where you are on a victimhood totem pole of oppression points as being the key to say, so what I would say with trans is I think it's sacred, but it's not as sacred as race. And one of the reasons you have a battle between feminism, or at least certain strands of feminism, and trans activism is because, at least to some degree, they're both in the middle of that totem pole. Now, yes, trans might be seen as more oppressed, and therefore they are above the cis heterosexual woman. But at least, feminism it has some clout in the system. And so there is a bit of a battle, and it's not as open and shut as it would be if we were talking about indigenous versus white, for example, or female versus male. Then you'd have then you'd be dealing with a much higher card against a much lower card. Whereas one of the reasons I think that we have more acceptance of the gender critical feminist claims is partly because there is an oppression story there. And so there is at least some contestation. And so you're not just going to you can't easily brush away the feminists and just accuse them of being transphobic, and that's the end of it. I mean, they try.
Well, that sort of happened a lot. Like I'm just thinking of this whole war that's going on, and you have people like Megan Murphy, and they've just been completely marginalized to the point where if there's any kind of coverage of, they won't even talk, like she won't even be talked to about it. So I sort of see the feminism aspect where you're really talking about oppression on the basis of sex. That doesn't seem to be very prominent anymore. It just seems to me, and all these people have just been pushed aside because of their position on the trans phenomenon.
I think you're right. There's no question that trans occupies a higher rung on that oppression hierarchy.
Yeah.
But I think Canada is, to some degree, and the US perhaps to a lesser degree, and maybe Australia, New Zealand, they are perhaps behind a curve that is starting to shift. And certainly in Britain, where I'm based normally, there you certainly, and what I would say, a couple of things. First of all, I would say that even the Labour Party, the left-wing party here, has accepted a lot of the gender critical critique, the Cass report, for example, and they've rejected self-ID. You can't just identify as a woman. There are quite a few steps to go through. So the pushback against trans activism has succeeded to a significant, not complete, but significant degree here. And so whether that's women's in sports or in women's prison, biological males in women's sports and women's prisons, that's really not happening here. And if you look at the public opinion data, both the US and Britain, shows about a 20-point shift against the trans position in the public opinion data over the last 2-3 years. I don't have data for Canada. I suspect it would be similar, but I actually suspect it would be similar. And I know that's not reflected in the institutions or in the media, but I think it would be reflected. That would be an interesting one to test. But I did surveys in Britain, the US, and Canada, 2021 to 2023. The Canadian one was 2023. And there were no gaps on any of these questions between those three countries. In the public opinion, anti-woke in all three countries at the same level. So I think what's happening in Canada is the institutions are very highly insulated from public opinion, more so than in the US. You've got two parties. So you have the red states and the Republicans pushing against this position. Canada, you've now had a few somewhat small steps taken by a few premiers in Saskatchewan, Alberta, New Brunswick, and a little bit by the leader of the Conservatives. So there's a little slight pushback, but it's very mild. They're still testing the waters, but it's not the same as Britain, where they've really, if the Labour Party tried to say trans women are women, then that would be a problem for them electorally. So they have backed away from that.
So, okay, I've grilled you a little bit on your
Yeah.
views there, Eric. So feel free to ask me a question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd be interested in your views on the indigenous question in Canada
Yep.
and what's going on with the mass graves hoax. And okay, so which
Yeah.
you've done a great job in helping to you and
Yeah.
others in helping to sort of bring to light. But where do you think elites are? Is there any breaking of the ice on this, or is it just completely beyond the pale for Canadian elite culture and institutions?
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting area. First of all, I guess I should say, and this is something I want to talk about in a few months in Regina,
Yeah.
about the word hoax, the use of the word hoax to describe what's happened,
Hmm.
which and there's a bit of a debate going on amongst my research group about this. And I would personally argue against using the word hoax because I think a lot of this is in the indigenous kind of realm is misremembering. It's a hysteria. It's a kind of it's a mass, it's the mass graves hysteria where people really, even when they're given the facts, like between the eyes,
Hmm.
they're just brain addled. Like they can't, this is their belief, and they're just impervious to changing it. So it's been interesting watching this develop for 3 years. I'm amazed at how it's pretty much known, and people are maybe saying it behind closed doors, that it's an incredibly improbable hypothesis that there are these clandestine burials, especially in the Kamloops case. So the Kamloops case is the area that I've studied
Right.
in depth, and that is an absurd claim about Kamloops because there's no parent who said that their child has gone missing. It's obvious that we were given bait, such as a supposed human rib bone and a tooth and all these things, and then now no one even knows where those things are, and so on. And then the kind of maneuverings of people like Murray Sinclair and all these very, very self-serving entities in their involvement in all this, and the shutting down of the Simon Fraser archaeology department in terms of their ability to talk about the matter. It just goes on and on and on in terms of what seems to me to be fraud right now amongst the neo-tribal elites and the lawyers and so on. The people themselves, however, really, this is a hysterical kind of reaction, and it's amongst a population that doesn't really have an idea of objective truth anyway. So if you look at indigenous, and this goes back to sort of my work on indigenous culture generally, is if you look at what's called oral history, it's not about trying to develop some kind of objective, verifiable understanding. It's about entertainment. Whoever is the best orator is the one who has the high status, and so on. So it's not really even the same thing. And so, all these indigenous spokespeople, they don't really value pursuing an objective truth. So that's kind of what's gone on historically, I think, with
Right.
respect to this unmarked graves material. The leadership in Canada, part of it is they've just gone so far down this road, for them to pull it back is going to be a major embarrassment. So it's just easier to just pretend that it continues, that the whole thing continues. And you sort of see the language shift happening. And you see this in the media too, where they'll say something like the discovery of 215 probable
Hmm.
graves, that kind of language, the use of anomalies and so on. So it's kind of this word shift that's happened where they're no longer saying the discovery of unmarked graves. They have a little bit of, they had the wiggle room that they're doing, but there's been no retraction and no, oh, we sure screwed that one up. So yeah,
because I think from the perspective of what Jonathan Rauch over at Brookings calls the truth-based order, I mean, this is quite an interesting example of where emotional ideology is trumping the truth-based order.
exactly.
It's happening also on the sex as a spectrum type front, but this is another front where truth is being essentially eroded. If that were actually to get into, if that thinking were to get into the courts, which to some degree it has, that's the end of blind justice and the legal system. But I'm just wondering your thoughts also on the way this fits into the woke project, the sort of, call it the white elite woke project, which went all in on this because I think they wanted their George Floyd moment. This was their equivalent in Canada. And I'm just wondering how do you see this within a longer history of the romanticization of the indigenous and the whole noble savage tradition? I mean, how does that romanticism, does that play a part in this, or is this just a new ideological phenomenon?
I think it does play a part in the sense of it's got this irrational kind of character to it. So there has been, that's been part of the whole discussion about indigenous peoples really from the beginning of first contact. You have Baron de la Hontan. I'm not sure if you're aware of his travel writings. Anyway, there was this chief that he claimed that he had interacted with, whose name was Adario, and he was this sort of natural socialist. And Baron de la Hontan was a French aristocrat, or no, he was critical of the aristocracy, and he was using this as a kind of a foil to do that. And then, of course, there's Rousseau and a number of other figures that it's part of almost European philosophy to some extent, this romanticization. And then this became sort of part of the Aboriginal rights movement in the 60s and 70s. So it kind of has a foundational character to how indigenous issues are thought about, and the idea that the problems that we face can be solved by just turning everything over to indigenous groups. So the whole idea of integration and indigenous people becoming part of wider society is rejected in the current kind of thing. Now, wokeism is an interesting dovetailing, I guess, of this whole kind of area, because it's got a more, and this is where my idea of wokeism, although it has a lot of similarities to yours, one of the major differences for me is I really see it as a totalitarian position. So that's its character, is totalitarian. So we had identity politics in the 1960s and late 60s and so on, and it was seen as a one position amongst many at the time, and everyone who sort of looked at it, I think initially thought, well, it's not a big deal because they're just in a very ghettoized area of the university, so it won't really have very much of an effect on anything. Like they'll have their women's studies and they'll have their Black studies, but they're not really going to affect the whole nature of the academy. That was sort of the identity politics thing that happened. But then, starting in the 2000s, it became totalitarian in its approach. So it really took over the machinery and insisted that the views of these oppressed groups, victim groups. I agree with you about this kind of intersectional kind of thing of, you know, certain groups are seen as being more oppressed than others, and that gives them more clout in this kind of identity politics sort of thing. But the insistence is that everyone had to pretend to believe what these groups were putting forward. So the identity politics, that was kind of the nature of it, I think, which is in order for groups to empower themselves, everyone else has to pretend to believe what they think is true. So that's, and that is a crazy idea. I think I still find that to be jarring, but I think that is not inaccurate as to what they're demanding. But it was sort of like you could say, well, no, I don't. So, okay, you might think that, but I don't. Now it is, you must accept that. And if you don't, you are going to be canceled in terms of your livelihood. And then even worse, it's going to get into the legal realm. Like that's not far off if it isn't here already, that if you don't, you know, call some guy with a beard who wants to go into women's washrooms, you're going to be hauled before some human rights tribunal, and you're going to, you know, and in Canada, this feeds into what you were saying before. We've seen this most naked in terms of its totalitarian impulse on the indigenous file with what's called residential school denialism, this charge of residential school denialism. And I keep on thinking that we've had this, and everyone is sort of, although they think that residential school denialists, what they call that, are terrible people, and you know, it's disgust, right? It's this kind of, as you pointed out yourself, this is kind of, I thought was a really good insight, the disgust reflex. We're not going to put you in jail for that. But this keeps on rising up again and again. I see this.
Oh, really? Yeah, it hasn't died. This idea that they're going to criminalize denialism is still going on. Is that right?
It is. It rises
That's
up.
scary.
I know.
So you can't, if you speak the truth, which is scientifically, objectively true, you can go to jail. That's Orwellian, really, isn't it?
I know, and I'm amazed because I have seen people critiquing it and so on, but it just it keeps on being brought up, and this person's name is Kimberly Murray. She's the interlocutor on the quote unquote unmarked graves. So the government appointed this person as the kind of go-to person to do all these, you know, kind of funding and reports about these missing, quote unquote, missing children. And there are no missing children. Like, this is the other kind of frustrating thing, is that what you have is, and this is in Kimberly Murray's report, her kind of testimonials people give, someone has an aunt who was buried somewhere and they're not sure where they're buried, and they like to know that. That's what we're talking about. Anyway, in her report, she has the residential school denialism. I saw something from a law society where there was mutterings about this terrible thing called residential school denialism. So it's kind of, it's in the background, but it's still there, and it just continues. So yeah, that's the worst I've seen, is the residential school denialism. And of course the pronouns and the trans thing is the second worst thing that I've seen as well, where if you don't, your employer can be liable for employees who refuse to use the pronouns of another employee, these kinds of things. So that's
it is astounding. But I guess perhaps in my book, what I think that I would draw a stronger link between the Great Awokening starting in the mid-2010s and what I would call the Second Awokening, which was the late 80s, early 90s, which is when I first entered the university. I was already aware. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when The Closing of the American Mind by Bloom came out, and reading that. And to remember being lectured when I was at UBC, actually in the forestry faculty, we got this big kind of feminist finger-wagging lecture as an entire faculty. And just, you know, even though you could say that the level of cancellations wasn't as high, of course, we don't actually have the data going back before around 2000 in the FIRE data.
Yeah.
But you certainly had incidents like UBC's political science department in the mid-90s. I don't know if you remember when it was roiled by the...
No, this is, you just hit a chord with me, because I was at the University of Victoria
Yeah.
in from 87 to 1992. And that's before UBC, was when we had the chilly climate meltdown in when was the date? It was, because I left in 1992 and with my master's degree from there, and it was just starting to take off in 1992.
Okay.
And I was like, and it was kind of funny, because this was where I could have easily gone along that woke path. It's kind of, because I remember the whole discussions going on about this. And this is what woke is. This is why wokeism is so frightening, is because it uses compassion to assert its authoritarianism. And this is what happened, is you had these compassionate male professors who welcomed a viper into their nest. Summer Broadrib was her name. And she was this Foucauldian radical feminist. Oh, anyway, so she was on it was a power struggle that went on, and she used this like allegations of racism and sexism to try to kind of take down this political science department. And they were able to fight back. It was a lot of bruising. There was serious bruising that happened because of it, but they did finally get her out of there. And I don't know what happened to her. She just disappeared into the you know, the mist. But there are still like great huge divisions that were caused. And so that was the first in the early 90s, this kind of stuff that was going on.
But of course, we had a big wave, you know, the speech code movement, which really takes off around 1990. You had like 300 universities implementing these speech codes, and you had, you know, UCLA, the student newspaper, was closed down for criticizing or making fun of affirmative action. So what I'm saying is this idea of this authoritarianism, I think, first of all, it's not as new as we think, but the amplitude and the frequency is much higher now, because for a number of reasons. One is there are more activists that have been produced. Second, social media makes it easier to organize flash mobbings, and the like button allows for pylons. So there are all these reasons why we've got a higher frequency, but I see this as more of a quantitative change than a qualitative change. And actually, if you go back to the 60s, you know, there were some cancellations that happened in the 60s and 70s, and certainly no platforming. You know, military recruiters were kept off campus. Certain conservative professors had their classes occupied. And Nathan Glazer talks about this in his piece in The Atlantic in 1969, saying the free speech movement is now essentially a lie. You know, essentially its name belies what it really is, which is a threat to free speech. So I kind of think this is in the DNA of these ideas. You talk about compassion. So my book is very much about this. I argue this is very much about bleeding heart liberals being more important than cultural Marxists. So it's the people who have this framework that says minorities good, majorities bad. I feel warmth and empathy and compassion for race, gender, sexual minorities, and I feel fear and hostility to you know, whites and men. And so this is really this sort of very emotional makeup of left liberalism. And these aren't necessarily people who want to make revolution, who have class envy. This is just people who have been, you know, have bought into a kind of developing, evolving left liberalism, which really begins in the 1920s, I would argue, but is layering in the 20s and the 30s. So what comes in first is this fear of the majority. You can trace that back even to the 1910s, when in the US, prohibition and immigration restriction was put in the 1920s the Ku Klux Klan revival. So it's not that there was no justification to some of this, but it just went overboard. Similarly, with the 30s, fascism, of course, it's worth being vigilant about that at a time when these were very threatening movements.
Yeah.
But it was a mission creep, and within the ambit of fascism, they caught a bunch of people who weren't fascists, like the American scene artists were accused of being fascist, ridiculous claims in the 30s and 40s. So I just think there's this sort of longer lineage, which makes up this very simple reflex: majorities bad, minorities good. And that's the foundation of left liberalism. And this is not the radicals, this is just the liberals. And so they're very susceptible to any claims on behalf of race, gender, sexual minorities, and on behalf of oppressive racial majorities. And so I think that's where I'm critical of books like so if you take Chris Rufo or Francis Fukuyama or Yasha Monk, they're talking a lot about these intellectual developments in cultural Marxism. That's absolutely true, and there's no question that there's the same personnel and they are influential. But I think that revolutionary Marxist impulse, cultural Marxist impulse, wouldn't have got anywhere without the more evolutionary ratcheting. Well, we need more diversity, more equity, more inclusion. Oh, I don't want a revolution. I don't want Ibram X. Kendi type quotas, but oh yes, we need more. And so we need affirmative action. We need speech codes. We need all of these things because that's just the compassionate thing to do. And aren't we too white and too male? So I just think that gets us to the same place as BLM and the gender ideology and all the very radical stuff, and to the point where these things actually overlap and mingle and converge. And you don't need to do a lot of persuading, actually. And I've shown that in a lot of my surveys, where many sort of left liberal academics who are not far left are nevertheless quite persuaded by woke claims, whether that's decolonization, mandatory diversity statements, which are supported in my survey work by a majority of academics in the social sciences. And that's not just the cultural Marxists, that's a much wider swath. And I think we really need to be much more critical of this so-called empathy, which really is an ideology. If you scratch it a little bit, it clearly embodies, so it's empathy for some groups and not for others. Empathy for the trans women, but not for the gender critical women. Empathy for, it might be empathy for indigenous, but there's certainly no empathy for working class whites, poor whites. So it's empathy for some groups, which creates a cost to other groups.
Well, the minority seems, I think you're onto something there with the minority. Yeah. So empathy for the minority. So the white working class was the majority. So like it's a majoritarian. And that's why I think that wokeism is in terms of this it's an anti-democratic, like it really is opposed to democracy. And there is this, in liberal democracy, there's this kind of tension between majority rule and individual rights, minority rights. And so some liberal Democrats are more on the majority rule side, and some are more on the minority rights, individual rights side. And certainly the woke are on the rights side of things, as opposed to the coalition building type of majority type of approach. But something that you've been saying, and I think we should definitely get to this, because this is going to be a big difference between you and me, which we should probably have a discussion about, is this whole cultural Marxism, cultural socialism, etc., all this kind of, that sort of way of framing it, which I don't accept. I think this is a serious flaw in the work of some and I have a lot of respect for all of these people who are, taking on wokeism and everything, but I think going down the path of the cultural socialism, cultural Marxism side really doesn't make a lot of sense. And you mentioned here, in terms of your own work, there's two aspects of what this whole wokeism kind of stuff that you're analyzing: equal outcomes and safetyism. Equal outcomes, what is the outcome that is wanted to be equal?
So it could be representation at Harvard. It could be research grant representation. So getting rid of all race gaps, gender gaps. I mean, this is very much a race sex thing. So it's equal representation in parliament, equal representation in the boardroom, any desirable social position, any profession that doesn't have enough, or that where males or whites are overrepresented. Ipso facto, disparities equals discrimination. That's kind of the Kendi argument. So I think that, and there's even an argument, you know, that, again, this is the sort of critical race, gender ideology argument that, you know, if we allow people free speech, then that upholds a structure of oppression and discrimination. So we can't have them have their free speech, because that silences, quote unquote, others, and reinforces these invisible structures we can't touch and feel. That, but you have to believe me because they're there. So what I mean is, that's the sort of, you know, it's wealth, power, and prestige differences by race and sex. That's the core of the equity manifested in affirmative action, for example, and equity. The other part, of course, as you say, is the safetyism. So where I disagree, where I'm with you, and where I'm disagreeing with those who say it's all about cultural Marxism, and there's also an issue around Marxism, because Marx was obviously not woke so, at all. And in fact, but okay, so, and in fact, socialism is very unwoke up until, so there's kind of a sort of borrowing of this idea of it's all about power structures and it's all about inequality, but it's transposing it from, you know, class to identity. And so I think that's part of what goes on.
Yeah.
And I think you can see that in Marcuse, for example.
Yes. Well, I was going to mention him.
Yeah.
There's two figures that I think are the most important in wokeism.
Yeah.
Number one is Marcuse, and number two is a guy by the name of Fredrickson, who evidently this whole public administration, equity, diversity, this is according to James Lindsay. I just find all of the literature in this area to be so painful that I just prefer to just allow Norman Finkelstein and James Lindsay, and, you know, these people have more patience than I do about it to do the summarization of it. So I can just go in for the Cole's notes. But Marcuse is important because he was the diversionary force from class, which is objective. Like, this is the important part of historical materialism, as class is objective, as objectively defined by your relationship to the means of production. So are you a producer or are you an owner? Now, there's a very gray area in the middle, because in a very complex capitalist society, we have a lot of kind of occupational things which are kind of difficult to figure out, such as, you know, you're a professor who earns a salary, so that makes you a producer, but you're also a celebrity and a seller of your books and all these kinds of things. So that's
like ourselves.
Yeah, like ourselves. So
are we celebrities? Oh my God.
You know, we're in this kind of weird middle zone, petty bourgeois kind of zone. But still, it's looking at things in terms of a tangible thing that you can say, not like I'm a woman because I feel that I'm a woman, which is just completely subjective. It doesn't have any grounding at all in anything. So Marcuse went from the objective kind of basis of Marxism to the celebration of subjective identity. So he was the fulcrum that went from historical materialism to identity politics, and he's the figure that did that. And he was much more interested in race and gender and so on because of the the difficulties in organizing the working class and the frustrations that came about when, you know, the very, very well-off working class in the industrialized world were not very interested in revolutionary politics, because they had a boat in their backyard, and they were they were not,
Right.
it was not easy. So Marcuse is number one. And then we have the Fredrickson, who is the equity, diversity, and inclusion guy, who was arguing about, you know, transforming public administration to be concerned about this equity stuff. So equal shares, which was the representational question. So we kind of had this melding of a revolutionary kind of identity politics kind of logic and the Marcusean thing, and about how you had to clamp down on freedom of expression because fascists would be able to put forth their speech, and then we'd have, you know, Nazi Germany all over again. And then you had like the public administration stuff of the equal shares thing going on, and that kind of got married together in the wokest kind of thing. But this seems to me to be very capitalistic. Like it's got a
yeah. So I guess, boy, there's so much there. But because my first kind of instinct would be to say I'm not sure how much these intellectuals really ultimately move the needle compared to the on the ground protests and the new television, you know, the advent of television and televised civil rights movement, and figures like Martin Luther King, and all of that captured the imagination and the emotions. And I guess I would put a lot more store in these events and concrete identity social movements there, and that just totally changes the way the left was speaking, including left liberals, like at Partisan Review, Susan Sontag, I quote, you know, when she says whites are the cancer of human history, you know, that just comes out of nowhere in 1966. But I think that, you know, I mean, I guess I would say that strand of the picture does have a Marxist lineage, even if it is a departure from Marxism, that the oppressor oppressed, everything's about power, everything's about these structures that are keeping inequality in its place. Now that's taken or borrowed from Marxism, but you're right, of course, that you know, in fact, right up until mid-century, a lot of Marxists were accusing even people who talked about the civil rights movement and black rights as being, oh, that's a bourgeois concern. So what you don't have in Marxism, this is where I'm kind of critical of the Lindsay Rufo and even people like Yasha Monk and Fukuyama who talk about postmodernism, is that there isn't this therapeutic, touchy-feely humanitarianism in the Marxist tradition. And I think without that, because one way of explaining cancel culture is not, oh, they can't have free speech because they're upholding a structure of oppression. That's a somewhat intellectualized argument. But if it's just, well, they can't have free speech because they might harm the self-esteem and the emotion, they might trigger the emotional trauma of minority groups. That is not really a structural type of art. I mean, what that is a humanitarian psychotherapeutic therapeutic kind of argument. And that is a whole different lineage, which comes out of this humanistic psychotherapy, Carl Rogers and a name, you know, Abraham Maslow perhaps, but there's this whole brand that you have to affirm the patient coming out of psychotherapy in the early 60s. And that, I think, is arguably the more influential strand. And that's very quickly taken up by large corporations, which, let's not forget, in the US, they were engaging in racial sensitivity training in the 60s and 70s. So this racial sensitivity training stuff is already happening in the 60s and 70s. By the time of Ronald Reagan, it's already taken off. And Richard Hanania talks about this in his book, The Origins of Woke. So there is already a well-established, call it proto-DEI bureaucracy in large organizations in the US in the 70s, the 80s. And it's human rights or human resources professionals are expanding massively in this period. So all I would say is I see this as a kind of evolutionary development and not a sudden thing that's emerged in the 2010s. And I don't think we can explain we can't say that what we're going through now is a completely different paradigm from what was there in the 90s, and I would argue even earlier.
Yeah. Are you aware of the work of Christopher Lasch? So I think
Yes.
it's Frank Furedy mentioned him as being a significant kind of critic of this kind of therapeutic. So he identified Lasch. I'm not sure what the date was on that essay. This kind of therapeutic turn, which is happening. So there's kind of three strands here that are, I think, and this is, I totally agree with you, is that I don't think it's the intellectuals that are driving this. I think they're kind of allow us to kind of sort of understand it a little bit. Like,
right.
So,
they're trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, they're trying to make sense of it. So we have a big economic shift that is, and this is my historical materialism that's coming in here. So I tend to root that in that things that are happening for good. And, maybe that's flawed in terms of doing that, but we have an economic shift that is happening between the 1950s and the 1970s, from the industrial kind of blue collar type of economy to a more service oriented type of system, and then a moving of the industrial kind of core to the third what's called the third world. So that's all happening, and it continues to happen to this day. Wokeism is not associated with the blue collar working class kind of character of the economy. It's associated with the Googles and the Amazons and so on. And that's what it really, where it's kind of, where it's located. And that's why we see a lot of these kind of tensions bubbling up, which I was unaware of until about, I guess, 6 months ago, in the blue collar, what used to be blue collar towns in British Columbia. So that's something I've been introduced to relatively recently in Quesnel, Hull River.
I saw that. Yeah, I'm aware of both. Yeah. And I've been to both, by the way, but yeah.
That is like the history of those towns is blue collar mill towns and so on. That's all going. If it's not gone, like the economy. So now it is, searching around for a new kind of identity. Instead of being a blue collar kind of thing, it's going to be woke. And so now you got all these woke people moving in, trying to, basically coerce the blue collar element into, getting on board with, well, my favorite is changing the names of towns where you're going to have the name spelled in the International Phonetic Alphabet.
Right. All right.
Like the internet, this is a very curious thing. And I noticed it quite a while ago, but now I'm really noticing it. The International Phonetic Alphabet, people are pretending this has got some indigenous character to it. So they want to spell all these names in the International Phonetic Alphabet because it looks like it's some kind of exotic indigenous tradition. But of course, indigenous languages are pre-literate. They didn't have any writing. So this International Phonetic Alphabet is a bunch of woke people who are tied into the linguistic side of the Aboriginal industry that are now insisting that all these names be spelled in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So they can get like grants and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in shirk funds. It's amazing. Anyway, that's kind of a bit of an example of the economic shift and how the woke are tied to this very much international capitalist class knowledge, like social media, banks. The banks are another serious area of wokeism, which, you just go into any bank, kind of branch, you're just hit with the pronouns and the pride flags and the territorial land acknowledgements and all these woke kinds of elements.
Well, but I guess, and this might be an area where we really do genuinely disagree. My view is that economic stuff, the economic shifts have almost nothing to do with what we're seeing. And now I'm familiar with those towns and their economies. Some of them had shutdowns earlier, some had shutdowns later. These things don't really time necessarily as closely with the upsurge of this stuff. What I think is going on is essentially you have civic elites in these towns who are influenced, I lived in Peace River, Alberta, a very remote community for 1 year. And there's always this mystique about, whatever the large center, it might be Edmonton in that case, but and there's always a certain group that is looking to leave town and to have upward mobility. And I think there's an extent to which they will be affected by fads and trends. I think we have to separate the fads and trends and the prestige side of things. So at one time, for example, temperance was a prestigious value. 1890, let's say. We know in the US temperance movement, its elite was very much the social elite in 1890. By 1925, it was lower middle or upper working class. Those values had lost prestige. You look at DEI, those are a set of prestige values. So a bunch of people will herd in behind them for self-interested reasons. However, the driver is in the ethos of the society. And I think if we take, say, Quesnel or Powell River, there's no question in my view that you have a kind of aspiring local elite that thinks this is just, if you are prestigious, you have to be in with these values. And you have some genuine, you have genuine believers in the religion as well. Left liberals in all of these towns, they're a larger or smaller component. They're probably smaller amongst those with direct blue collar experience, but still. So I think that's what's going on really, is this is really an entirely cultural thing. What's interesting is you now see that DEI is being cut back, at least in the tech firms. And so corporations are actually leading on cutbacks in DEI, and it's the public sector and the universities that are lagging. And I think that tells us something, which is that when this thing is costly and it loses a bit of prestige, and I think DEI has lost some prestige, then I think you see that the incentives are such that you'll cut it back to some degree. You'll prune the bush in the corporate world, but the sort of public sector, you don't see that as much. You see it a little bit, but not as much. I kind of see it as largely orthogonal. I see it as a sort of set of cultural memes, a kind of mind virus like COVID that has expanded out. And it's quite, yes, of course, there are more people from an educated background who like to be in the forefront of these trends and who are captured by these meaning systems more so than those in the working class. I think that's true. But as with populism, by the way, when you actually run statistical analyses of survey data, as I do, the pure economics, whether you've lost your job, whether you are working class in your occupation, you have lower income, makes almost no difference when you control, certainly for university education. Your class position makes almost no difference to your views on support for Donald Trump or Brexit. A bit more for Brexit than for Trump. Likewise, I think for woke, again, if you run those numbers, almost nothing to do with economic position or income. So I'm quite skeptical. I think this is a wholly independent mind virus that has its own dynamic and isn't really, you can look at countries, some countries like Sweden, which are more quote unquote socialist, others like Ireland or the United States are more kind of freewheeling market societies. And this ideology has had strong penetration across both, just the way populism, national populism is strong in countries like, Sweden and countries like Austria, which might be a bit more statist, France, more statist, but it's also strong in more free market societies as well. And so I just don't think we can really explain these kind of cultural movements so much by the economic side. So that would be that's what the data tells me anyway.
Well, I think in order to test this, and I'm intrigued about this because in order to test if there's some economic foundation to this, you would need to separate out the industries. So you'd have to do a analysis of like an auto plant. Like what is the ethos, the managerialist ethos in an auto plant versus Google, right? And you can sort of tell this a little bit by and I think that a little bit the DEI stuff is a management tool. So it's a way of forcing your workers to go in a certain direction. You want them to do things, and now you use this DEI battering ram and accuse them of all sorts if they're doing something which is a bit not what the corporation wants them to do. So it's not applied evenly. These things, they're used as weapons, the DEI stuff. So I think it's a human resource. It's in the human resources kind of framework, the DEI stuff, and it's a managerialist tool. And once you've broken down the opposition that you're fighting against, then you can sort of just remove the DEI stuff. It's a bit of a, I heard Daniel Dennett talking about this. What's it called? It's called a crop. It's called a nursing crop or something. It's there as to help along this increasing autocratic kind of maneuver. Yeah. And once you get that in there, you remove the DEI stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my view is more that the DEI has emerged as initially as an obligation that was imposed, and Richard, obviously in the US case, through this idea of disparate impact law and through this definitions of harassment and hostile, so-called hostile environment. There was this case where even having criticizing the supreme leader of Iran, that being perceived as creating an Islamophobic hostile environment. But these are kind of mores that come from academia through into the courts, through into the media, and I think also affecting the corporate class, but also the young employees coming out of the Ivy League and other universities into these corporations. And I guess my view of it is the closer you are to production, the actual business side of these corporations that are making things, the weaker the sway of this stuff. It seems to come from the communications and human resources side, which is closer to the more social science, legal compliance, branding side of the business. And so but of course, I do also accept that you'd much rather have your workforce worrying about DEI and race and sex divisions than about class divisions, because so I think there's something in the Marxist critique, absolutely, and there's been obviously a plethora of left-wing anti-woke books coming out in the last few years. Susan Nyman.
I highly recommend Norman Finkelstein's book. I'll burn that bridge when I come to it.
Okay.
But anyway, I know that you are running short on time, but I wanted to the therapeutic, just to summarize for people what I was going to say before I got a little bit distracted, is I can sort of see, and not to say that this is wound up with the intellectual, but it's kind of strands of understanding. The Marcusean kind of identity politics diversion away from class politics, the Fredrickson diversity, inclusion, and equity kind of public administration kinds of things, and then this whole therapeutic kind of area, which I hadn't even thought about. I knew about Lash and his discussion, but I hadn't even, because that therapeutic side is very strong with the wokeism stuff, because it kind of is always into this protection, self-esteem, all this kind of stuff, which
fragility, the minority fragility, trauma, and all this stuff.
Anyway, Eric, well, I should I should bring this to a close, because I think we have gotten into a whole bunch of different areas. It almost kind of raises more questions than it answers. But I wanted to thank you very much for putting forward your views. I think I'm really looking. I haven't read your book yet, but it's on my list of the various sort of anti-woke kinds of things, which I think is part of the coalition against wokeness, where we just have to, like, the arguments about capitalism and all these things have to be put to the side right now, because what we're doing is we're fighting for the ability to have discussions about these matters, as opposed to the whole of the economic kinds of arguments. Before we close, though, is there anything that you wanted to say that you felt you were not able to say in this discussion?
Well, not really, other than to say, I mean, I think that there's an emerging scholarly literature and even what I would call a field of academic endeavor. Of course, it's not represented in academia, but all the books we're talking about are creating a literature. Now, I have an open online course, 15-week course at the University of Buckingham on woke, where I try and go through the differences within this literature, those who say it's about economics, those who say it's about cultural Marxism versus, so there is a whole sort of set of these conceptual debates and divisions, and it's a really interesting area and an important area. So I cover that in the course, which, by the way, anyone can sign up to, I should say, at the University of Buckingham, and also in the book. And I think it's something I'm thinking about, is maybe holding a conference on this, because I think it's worth, as a sort of, whether people are in academia or not, this is a real and very important area of study. And also the last point is really that culture wars is not just about culture. I mean, it affects your ability to control your border. It affects your ability to control crime, to have an education system, to recruit for a military. If everybody is trashing the national past, which again is tied into the indigenous stuff, then it's going to be hard to recruit for the military, the police. So it's just worth saying that culture wars is not just about culture, but about a lot of actual bread and butter issues. So yeah, to be continued. I'm sure we could go on for many moons, but this has been great.
Organize that conference, Eric.
Okay.
I'll be there.
Yeah, I hope so. All right.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eric. I look forward to future conversations with you.
Thanks, Francis. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.